me that you see the opening slide? Oh, I see a thumbs up. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Oh, there's the Q&A. All right, I'm just buying some time as people join us. Oh, God, the sound is good. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to wave my arms for future me clipping this recording. So thank you for that. Good morning and welcome to our 2024 Land Use and Housing Laws Monthly Engagement Meeting. This is meeting 2 for September, and it's September 27th. A few reminders here at the top. We are talking about these main laws that we are working to support the implementation. And we will go through where we have been and what has been recently completed and what is coming up over the next months in today's webinar. We also are recording this webinar and we will post it and the slides on our Engage DOLA webpage, but we will cut the recording when it comes to our Q&A section at the end. Speaking of engagement, here's a reminder on our engagement framework. So we do have an ongoing email-based set of reminders. We have our big event, which is today is an example of our monthly tool-based engagement webinar. So again, this is a standing time to present draft tools, receive input, and otherwise inform our guidance and resources that we're creating to support implementation of these new laws. We also have biweekly office hours. We have supplemental technical assistance that you can request one-on-one meetings to talk about your jurisdiction-specific questions, dive into the weeds there. We do ad hoc presentations by request, and we have our ongoing web-based engagement. So that's the Engage DOLA site pictured here. That has all kinds of information, including what we call the project timeline. It's sort of the implementation timeline across the laws, update calendar, and other resources. Those of you who have provided comments on the draft maps that we'll talk about later, as well as participated in the parking survey, for example, will be familiar with this site. How's it going? Well, here are a few stats of late. Since our last convening, we've hosted 5 office hours. We've fielded 4 kind of getting into the weeds, ADU specific questions that can get more complex than it may seem on its face. And we've received 17 questions and comments on Engage DOLA about the transit-oriented communities and parking maps. And responses varied depending on what the question or comment was. Sometimes email-based, sometimes it led to one-on-one meetings. And of course, as I noted here, that it's ongoing. So if you're thinking, hey, I haven't received a response yet, some questions require more robust putting together of information. So answer is forthcoming. And then also we did receive 27 survey responses to that parking best practices survey. Thank you so much for those of you who took the time to inform that work. And, I'd also like to add, as we keep underscoring when it comes to engagement, if you're worried about not having been able to contribute something, please reach out at your earliest feeling of that type so that we can work with you on how to get further information. We're doing a lot on a tight timeline, yes, but we certainly don't want to have a closed door. So please reach out. A reminder on the general structure of these webinars. We're going to move through almost law by law, though if you remember, we're calling them more tracks because neighborhood centers and strategic growth kind of go together. So we pulled things apart a little bit. Last month, we gave a lot of introductory information. We introduced the parking and TOC draft maps. Then there was a flurry of comment and engagement over the past month. And so we'll be able to, switching up today, talk about where that has gone, as well as these other items. So we're going to move next, after another quick slide from me, to TOCs. We'll talk about where we're at with parking, neighborhood centers, and strategic growth. There's more activity now on housing planning that I'll walk us through later, and then rounding it out with ADUs. Last couple of comments here. Is that same as last month, your questions and comments are critical to successful implementation. So thanks so much for being here. Thank you for engaging on our Engage DOLA webpage, reaching out by email, calls, everything that you're doing. Thank you. Please keep it up. During today's session, please do use the chat feature to ask questions, and feel free to unmute at the end. As I mentioned, we will be recording this portion, and then we'll cut that and do some Q&A there at the end. Can't say it enough, the Engage DOLA webpage is hopefully a good first point of contact, a good reference site. So go ahead and check that out for more information, for tools to comment on, and so on. And then yes, please go there, review to our main page to review our webinar on these laws overall if you want some more foundational information, as well as preliminary guidance. Okay, I'm going to stop it there so we can get into the meat of things today and hand it over to Nathan Lindquist from CDOT.
Thanks, Casey. I think you have to, I can't start my video.
Oh, goodness, thank you.
But good afternoon, everybody. Nathan Lindquist. I'm a senior land use planner with CDOT. There it goes. So we are going to do a quick overview of transit-oriented communities, a couple slides, and then turn over to Kelly Blinn for the majority of this presentation. Next slide. I kind of wanted to go over just a couple of the common questions we've been getting from local governments and others on TOCs. First one comes up a lot, is the housing opportunity goal a requirement that housing units must be constructed? And this is a key point in that the HOG is really just a target for zoning capacity. And kind of the preliminary analysis we've done shows that, generally around the region right now, you see about 10 to 20% of zoning capacity getting constructed as housing. So I think that'll be an important thing going forward, because obviously folks see the HOG number and it looks like a really big number. But in communities that have already reached this density, you don't really see all of that getting built out in any kind of short or medium term kind of period. So another question then, number 2, simpler. Do all transit areas need to be covered by dense zoning? We've talked about this a lot. When the maps come out of the transit areas, it'll be easy for folks who haven't been involved to see those maps and see the quarter-mile buffer and think all of that has to be zoned for density. And of course, as we've discussed, transit centers where density goes can be located in a variety of spots and not in other spots. And the areas where it can be located include optional transit areas, so it can be spread out a bit more if that makes sense for a jurisdiction, if it meets the criteria in the bill. Third question, will there be a change to the transit area maps if transit routes change over time? And the answer is no. The law has been written as a snapshot in time, so it's based on existing plans and existing transit service as of January 1st, 2024. So if transit service changes, the maps will not change. Fourth question, does the law require that local governments provide infrastructure to serve all new areas zoned for housing? And the answer to that is no. Local infrastructure standards, of course, may still require developers to pay for infrastructure upgrades if those are necessary, whether it's water, sewer, or streets. And in many cases, those are expensive enough to where, it's going to take a long time, either through grants or some mix of different funding sources to build that infrastructure. Or in some cases, it may be just a hard cap on, a water plant capacity. So obviously, just because the zoning's in place does not mean that you need to serve development if it doesn't meet basic health safety standards. Obviously, all things have to have water, sewer, and streets. So just wanted to go over those 4 items, and we can go to the next slide. We're working on all of these items for TOCs. We're going to talk about the transit area mapping today more. The calculation model development, we've kicked that off with our consultant, Echo Northwest. Had a great meeting yesterday with 20 to 30 local government planners who are doing the technical work to get their input on, how can we create a model that's going to be helpful for them, given that there's such a wide variety of types of zoning. And so it was a really great discussion. The TOD guidance manual development, we're looking at that as trying to get kind of a chapter 1 of guidance published that gives a basic summary of the law. And that we've got a first draft of that, and we're going to be working on cleaning that up and getting that published. And we kind of look at that as something that's going to evolve over time as we get input from folks, given the complexity of the TOC law. That should say TOC instead of TOD there. And then, as just preliminary TOC assessment reports that's due in June 2025. A lot of one-on-one meetings with local governments to just see where they're at and what questions they have and how we can support them on the HOG calculation and transit center development. Next slide. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly Blinn to go through the rest of these.
Great, thanks, Nathan. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Okay, I've been having microphone issues, so thanks everyone for being here. Just wanted to provide some updates on the transit areas mapping. We presented the drafts last month and did receive a number of comments, so thank you all for taking the time to review those and get us your comments and questions. We've been going through those and assessing. Just some reminders before I get into what some of those comments were. The maps were created based on quite prescriptive criteria and statute, and we did go over that in detail last month. It's also explained further in the mapping documentation that we've published, sort of what the statute says and what that means in practice. In terms of how these maps will be used for the transit-oriented communities law, the maps will be used to identify the acreage of transit areas that will go into calculating the housing opportunity goal, as well as the areas where transit centers may be located. So sort of that denser zoning that communities will either already have in place or will put in place to reach their housing opportunity goal. And so just some key reminders is that the transit areas maps don't yet account for exempt parcels, which will be identified by the jurisdictions, and we'll be putting out some more guidance about that soon. And that there's time. The calculation of the housing opportunity goal and identifying exempt parcels are not due until next summer, June 30th, 2025. We had just heard a little bit of confusion that the September 30th date was the due date for that as well. And it's really just a due date for the state. So wanted to make sure that that was clear. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so just a quick summary of some of the comments and questions we got. We did get several kind of route-specific comments and questions in terms of why some routes were or weren't included, or why a particular alignment was mapped in some of the cases of the planned BRT routes that are in DRCOG's plans. And so some of that has led to adding some additional optional transit area routes that were missed in the first draft maps. And so that adds a little bit more flexibility in some cases of where transit centers can be located. We also got some questions, because we know it is complicated, about how the walk sheds portion of the law applies in general, as well as to a few specific stations. And so we'll be continuing to work to provide kind of more clear explanations and visuals. And if folks have more questions, please reach out to us. One other kind of category in general of questions that I think we got is sort of why certain areas were mapped that can't allow residential, for example. We got some questions about airport land, which that is considered an exemption in the law. And so that kind of goes back to my earlier reminder of like, this is just mapping the transit areas and what the statute directed us to include in terms of the distance from certain transit services. It doesn't yet exempt parcels where, say, residential development can't happen, like on airports. So that'll be the next step. And we've just been kind of going through and helping make sure we're answering all those questions. You can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we've added a few routes to the optional transit areas that do have portions of the routes with 30-minute planned service. There were some examples of some slight errors in jurisdiction boundaries that were caught. And so we've been making sure that gets edited. And then just some minor edits to the documentation to clarify what the transit areas are and how to use the walk sheds, et cetera. So apologies that it's not published yet. We're going to publish everything Monday, and we'll make sure to get an email out once those final versions are up. I say final with a bit of an asterisk. My last bullet here is just a flag. We know this was really quick, and we appreciate everyone taking time to review who has. We can make updates after September 30th. That was the deadline in statute. And so we wanted to, get as much done as we could by that time. But if there are other data issues that are found, please feel free to flag them to us. We can make those small changes. This isn't, as Nathan was mentioning, about changes to transit service or plans, since the law does direct us using kind of this snapshot in time. But yeah, if we know this was a quick timeline, so please reach out to us if you catch other data issues. We can go to the next slide. Just because we did get a number of questions on how the walk sheds work, we wanted to go through this at least briefly. And we I think sent some of these slides out after the last meeting, and we have this information in the mapping documentation. We know there may still be questions because it is a little complicated, as I mentioned. So, please feel free to let us know what would be helpful. But just as a reminder, the walk sheds, the purpose here is, I think, recognition that some station areas have a major barrier kind of outside the jurisdiction's control, whether that's an interstate highway or railroad tracks, that makes it more difficult to do transit-oriented development. And so the law kind of directs the state to map these walk shed areas that, can be utilized to exempt certain parcels that, say, aren't accessible from the station area. So yeah, and just a note that this just affects the overall housing opportunity goal calculation. But, if your jurisdiction is planning to, create much better accessibility with a pedestrian bridge or whatever it may be, you could still be locating your transit centers or your denser zoning in those areas. All right, we can go to the next slide. So this just shows kind of what the maps look like on the interactive maps that we've posted, and shows what it looks like where there's one side of the station that qualifies for this walk shed exemption. So in this case, we have the rail line running roughly north-south. And on the western side, in yellow, there's an area where the walk shed exemption does apply. And so in this case, on the west side, the subject jurisdiction would take into account the parcels that are in that yellow area, which is mapping what's within a half-mile walking distance from the transit station area. But the the remainder of the area on the west side of the rail line, they could essentially exempt out of their housing opportunity goal calculation. Hopefully that makes some sense. We will continue to try to clarify what that looks like. And I think especially as we get into the exempt parcels, we can kind of show some more detailed visuals of what that looks like. All right, we can go to the next slide.
Can I also add, we have also been meeting one-on-one with communities to walk through this step by step. And if that sounds interesting to you, let us know.
I think I just saw a question about whether DOLA will be calculating the walk sheds or if that's up to jurisdictions. So as part of the mapping exercises, we have mapped the walk sheds, and that those are up on the draft website, and it'll be finalized by Monday. So the jurisdictions can, just use the walk sheds that have been mapped.
I might add
go ahead.
that just to say, right, I guess the idea is if the GIS file is on there and it kind of allows you to clip it, and then you can, hopefully the jurisdiction on its own can subtract, the walkshed area to figure out what is exempt parcels. But to the specific question, if any local jurisdiction needs more GIS assistance with that kind of thing, please do reach out, because that's something we can potentially help with. But we assume maybe as a baseline, jurisdictions might just kind of want to do that on their own just so they know. But please reach out if you need help. Back to you.
Okay, great. We wanted to show one example because this occurs in a few cases where, so you'll see here in the kind of pop-up on the interactive map, each one explains sort of where the walkshed exemption applies. And so in this case, it applies north of the highway. But you'll notice that there's no yellow area kind of mapping what that half-mile walkshed is. And that's because there's no pedestrian crossing from the station. And so there is no walkshed north of the station, which essentially means all that area can be exempted. So we just wanted to kind of show an example of what that looked like, since most of them do have, some yellow area showing that the half-mile walkshed on the side of the station where that exemption applies, but some of them do not. All right, we can go to the next slide. And then there's a few where no walkshed area will show up, none of this like hatched either yellow or gray area. And that's because the walkshed exemption doesn't apply there. We've included, as I noted on the previous slide, notes about where the walkshed applies in each case. And there's also a spreadsheet that highlights, all of the stations. And so even ones where it isn't mapped, you can kind of go in and see for the stations in your jurisdiction what applies where. And happy to follow up if there are questions on that.
And I'll just note this part of the law just is very nuanced, and with GIS limitations, somewhat difficult to show extremely clearly. And so I still get confused. So if others get confused, feel free to reach out and we can walk through like what applies to where. But hopefully there's enough information where it makes sense.
Yeah. Thanks, Nathan. All right, I think we can go to the next slide here. This is just a brief reminder of kind of the different elements that we have published as drafts, and then on Monday, they will all be updated to final. So we have this documentation that explains sort of the statutory direction, the data sources we used, and how the maps were created. There's an interactive ArcGIS online map where the different layers can be viewed. We also have just the raw shape files for download if you want to use those in your own GIS software. And then we also have a Google spreadsheet just with, if you don't have GIS and you want to be able to look at kind of how routes were classified or how stations were classified in terms of the walkshed area, that's another way to view it. All right, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so Nathan mentioned this a little bit, so I'll go through this quickly. But again, the housing opportunity goal calculation and figuring out exempt parcels not due for a while, so we have some time. That said, we are working to get out some initial guidance about how to do the housing opportunity goal calculation and document parcel exemptions. Probably put out sort of a sample spreadsheet and guidance document to include more information about that. I think in general, we're planning to publish sections of the TOC guidance as we have them ready, just since I know, some folks haven't yet started, some are eager to get started based on how other planning timelines are shaking out. And so we do want to put out information as soon as possible, even as we're working through some sections that might come later. All right, we can go to the next slide. And then just wanted to give a brief overview of the TOC calculation model project. Nathan mentioned we had a first kickoff meeting yesterday for this project. Basically, part of the TOC law directs the state to publish a model and guidance by the end of February of next year to help transit-oriented communities with calculating the density and dimensional standards in their codes to be able to estimate the net housing density allowed in their transit centers so they can meet their housing opportunity goals. And so we do have a consultant on board, Echo Northwest, as Nathan mentioned, that's going to be helping us develop the calculation model and accompanying user guide. And that model will be able to help communities assess their current zoning capacity towards meeting the HOG, whether or not you're using kind of a dwelling units per acre type restriction on density, or whether you regulate density in other ways, like through height or setbacks, et cetera. It'll be designed to kind of take in your standards and help estimate that zoning capacity. And then secondly, it'll be designed to provide a consistent format and guidance to test and submit transit centers towards meeting the housing opportunity goal. So we just began some working group meetings with subject jurisdictions yesterday, and we'll be working this fall to put out a draft for comment, and then finalizing that early next year. Right, and we can go to the next slide. I think this is me too. So I'll go through some updates on the parking law relatively quickly. The timelines for this one are a little more straightforward. So one kind of update is we have some guidance on implementing the parking law that we just published yesterday. So it's up on the Engage DOLA site for comment. We have the parking best practices technical assistance materials that the study that we're working on currently. So we're doing a number of different input opportunities this fall, and then the due date is at the end of the calendar year. And then the deadline for complying with the law is June 30th of next year. So we can go to the next slide. So similarly to the TOC law, HB 241304 directs the state to publish certain maps by this coming Monday. And again, includes sort of very prescriptive criteria for which transit services to include for transit agencies that are within MPOs. And again, it's sort of this snapshot in time based on plans or existing service as of January 1st of this year. All right, we can go to the next slide. So just a quick summary of some of the comments that we got and updates. Similarly, we had some route-specific comments and questions that did lead to us identifying a few RTD routes that have planned 30-minute service for some portion of their route for at least 4 hours per weekday, which is the criteria in the law. And so there's a few changes there. We also got some questions regarding applicability to unincorporated areas, because there are some kind of small areas in some cases where the buffers around the transit stops are included. There weren't changes made, but just clarification of sort of how the law applies. And then again, similarly to the TOC law, some questions regarding kind of why the areas were mapped that can't allow residential, again, like airport land. So the maps aren't changing, but because multifamily housing isn't allowed there functionally, the law doesn't apply there. And again, other updates can be made after September 30th if there are other additional data issues that you identify. So please feel free to reach out if you're finding those. All right, we can go to the next slide. I won't go through this all again, just the same sort of set of files will be available on Monday on the Engage DOLA site for this law as well, coming soon. And as I mentioned, we do have kind of our version 1 guidance for the minimum parking requirements law published on the Engage DOLA site. It includes a summary of the law, sort of the key components. It includes guidance for implementation in local land use codes and processes, and some actual examples of local codes in Colorado and how they could be updated to comply with the law. So encourage folks to review and submit any comments or questions you have on the Engage DOLA site. All right. As I mentioned, we're working on the parking management best practices study, which is due at the end of the year, which will be designed to help support local governments with implementing best practices in managing parking demand and supply. We received some great survey responses, as Casey noted, and they've helped us kind of identify some really good case studies to focus on in Colorado. So really want to thank folks. And now we're working on hosting some focus groups in the coming weeks to help us get more input into off-street parking strategies, on-street parking, and as well as kind of equity considerations and figuring out parking management strategies for affordable housing. So those are posted on the Engage DOLA calendar, just FYI, for subject jurisdictions if you're interested in listening in. And we can go to the next slide. Just as we've been getting comments and questions, the survey really focused on trying to identify good case studies and expertise that we have here in Colorado to draw from. We'd also love to hear from you, what you want out of these technical assistance resources. If there's messaging tools, code examples, whatever you think might be most helpful for implementing the minimum parking requirements bill successfully, please reach out to us since we are developing this resource as we speak and want to make sure it's useful to you all. Okay, next slide. And then I think I'm passing it to, is it Nathan next? Great.
Yep, back to me. Thanks, Kelly. So just wanted to go over one quick update as far as the strategic growth in neighborhood centers track. And just as an overall reminder, we've kind of combined a couple of pieces of the laws so that when we go through engagement processes, it kind of goes more streamlined and more efficiently for all of our stakeholders who will be asked to go to a lot of meetings over the next couple of years. But so this includes the strategic growth report, neighborhood centers, and potential transit areas. And all these elements focus on incentives, collaboration, and planning that are statewide. So there's really no mandatory elements in any of these things, but it's kind of saying for the mandatory elements, we're really focusing on the MPOs, which are pictured in that map. And then both within the MPOs and then outside of the MPOs in the rest of the state, there's still a lot of great work that local governments, regional governments, nonprofits, and everyone are doing. And how can the state support that work better? how can we all collaborate to grow in a way that's more environmentally and fiscally sustainable. Sorry. So next slide. The main area to talk about today is this first thing that was due on September 30th. It was called potential transit areas identification. Most of the rest of the elements with this track are a little bit later once we get into the winter and spring. So wanted to just talk about this one item. Next slide. So the potential transit areas tool was to really develop a corridor planning tool for corridors around the state that have a lot of significant planned greenfield development in the future, where there's anticipated large transportation infrastructure investments, and then where there's great potential for either future transit service and or neighborhood centers, which are mixed use, walkable neighborhoods like downtown areas and corridors where there's good potential for transit supportive development. So there's a September 30th deadline to publish a map. And after talking to regional and local partners, we wanted to have more time to continue working with the stakeholders to look at this through the strategic growth report process. And then we would basically publish just a blank potential transit areas map on September 30th, just to meet the statutory requirement, and then attach a note to it to say we're going to keep working on this. Because what we really decided we needed after talking to everybody was to incorporate the neighborhood centers criteria and think about how can you create kind of an evaluation tool for these corridors to help evaluate what areas are going to make sense for transit or not based on how development is being planned. So that's something since this is just a planning tool, it needs to be a planning tool that's useful for people. And to make it useful for people, we need more time. So we will kind of move forward in that approach is the plan. That's all I've got that. And I will turn it over to Casey for housing planning.
Thanks, Nathan. All right, moving right through it today. Housing planning. So this is Senate Bill 24-174, and we're doing quite a number of related but distinct things. So here's a reminder on what those pieces are and the timelines for them. We did publish that self-assessment tool and preliminary strategies menu, so you can find that on Engage DOLA. But that was, again, to answer the question of what if we've recently done a housing needs assessment? Is it compliant? Well, we're continuing to work on the housing needs assessment methodologies. And so we can't answer that with a period at the end of that sentence yet. So we have created that self-assessment tool as a first look about how compliance may be. We're going to focus today on a little bit on what's going on with the methodologies development and displacement risk assessment guidance, and then move into what's not listed on here, but is included in 174, which is new requirements for comprehensive plans. So that's what I'll talk about most today. Here's where we are with the methodologies. So we are, I would say maybe a month or more ago, I had hoped to be presenting potentially a draft methodology to show you. Here's how it's going. We're now on track to do that next month. So what we're looking at now is having a rough draft, about a week, and we are facilitating some legislation-directed interviews and focus groups. So much like with the TOC law, technical meetings, we are also doing some additional engagement for the housing needs assessment methodologies. So that's going to be ongoing over the next month and then probably lingering with the trickle onwards. Meaning next month we should be able to present the draft HNA methodologies as well as give you insight into feedback that we'll have been hearing by then. Please do continue to check on Engage DOLA for draft tools to comment on and a way to provide those comments. If you run into a hurdle, always please reach out, let us know. So we're looking forward to making some progress in the very, very quickly coming weeks on that project. Similarly, the displacement risk assessment guidance has kicked off. We are currently underway working with consultants creating a white paper on displacement mitigation. That then is going to translate into creating the displacement risk assessment guidance. So similar with the methodologies, we're hoping to be able to introduce that draft at next month's meeting. And so please keep an eye out for more information on that to come. If we have something to announce in the interim between meetings, then you can expect an email or an update on Engaged OLA. All right, let's dive into new requirements for comprehensive plans. I'm going to start off here with applicability. And you know what? I'm actually going to start off with calling myself out. I love having something nice to look at on a slide, and I'm very aware that, especially these next set of slides, a lot of text. Sorry, it's boring. I'll try and make it interesting with colorful commentary. But here we go. So comprehensive plans, about 130 jurisdictions currently are required to do comp planning. And also, others have elected to do comprehensive planning. So if you are one of those communities who must do a comprehensive plan or have decided to anyway, you may want to perk up your ears for information on what we have in place now. So again, Senate Bill 24-174 clarified some components of comprehensive plans, and here's the list of that. Comprehensive plans, sort of in a moving forward, but I'll talk about timeline as we proceed through the slides. But in a moving forward sense, must have this list of things. A narrative description of the procedure used for the development and adoption of the master plan. Again, in statute, our comprehensive plans are called master plans, so I will use those terms interchangeably for those who are wondering. It must also contemplate the most recent housing action plan. So if you recall, we're working on housing needs assessment guidance and methods, but also there's a housing action plan component of that law. So that's later in the timeline, but we'll be working on that. So comp plans must consider the most recent action plan, contemplate it. What did it recommend? What are we doing with that? As previously existed, there must be a recreation and tourism element. For some, there must be a consideration for this 3-mile plan. And then I really want to dig in today on a newly required strategic growth element and water supply element. So if you are currently updating your comp plan or you're about to, please take a special note of this. Here you go. I was able to find a picture. So for the water supply element, what must be in there? Well, if you're familiar with previous statutory language about a water element, we used to have some if-then language. If you're going to have a water element, then make sure to do these things. Now, after the recent legislation, those things must be included. So a water supply element must be developed in consultation with water suppliers in the area, estimate a range of water supplies and facilities needed to support potential public and private development described in that master or comp plan, and include water conservation policies. If you're wondering, these are things we tend to see in water elements in comp plans, but now those are required. How about strategic growth? Apologies for the lots of text here. I know I'm breaking some PowerPoint rules, but I wanted to make sure that you had this information right in front of you. And please go and feel free to check for even more detail, but I tried to give you the full detail with some brevity. So here's what we've got for the strategic growth element. This element is meant to, by the language of legislation, integrate elements of the master plan, discourage sprawl, promote the development or redevelopment of vacant and underutilized parcels, and mitigate the need for extensions of infrastructure. Under that banner, specifically, this element must include a description of existing and potential policies and tools to prevent sprawl, and then 2 bits of analysis. One, looking at vacant and underutilized sites near existing or planned transit or job centers. That analysis is meant to assess the feasibility of use for those sites, use as residential, and describe the public benefits of such development as an alternative to developing undeveloped land or agricultural land. The next analysis is similar, but an analysis of undeveloped sites that are not adjacent to developed land, but are under consideration for development. As part of that, there's a requirement to assess the feasibility of the use of that land as residential, and to describe the long-term fiscal impacts of construction on that site. So construction, ownership, maintenance, and replacement of infrastructure and public facilities, provision of public services to serve such sites. So that'll be the new analysis. We are working on developing guidance for this. Unfortunately, I have no news, but I wanted to at least flag what these requirements are and then let you know, yes, we'll be working to create some guidance for these newly required components. There's an exemption for the strategic growth element in a comprehensive or master plan. Municipalities, counties, regions are not required to include this element if they've not received funding to do so. And this is, I know I've set it up in a almost math problem kind of way, but it's complex. I find it difficult to approach when you're reading it as a paragraph. So I hope this clarifies. So again, the exemption is if you haven't received funding to do it, and you're a municipality of under 2,000 or 20,000 with a negative growth rate, or you're a county with a population under 5,000 in the unincorporated area, or 20,000, again, with a negative growth rate. So there are some exemptions there to the strategic growth element. I'm seeing some questions in the chat, but cannot. Well, I'll let, we'll work on question. We'll have others work on questions so I can keep rolling. Thank you for putting them in the chat and flagging. We will make sure to restate the question as we answer. Okay, for now, we'll move to accessory dwelling units. And Kelly, I'll just move through, but please feel free to speak up with anything if you like. All right, ADUs. House Bill 241152, here's where we're at in the timeline. We did recently publish guidance. I have a slide on that to give you a visual, and are going to be working with consultant support on an ADU toolkit. This, similar to other requirements we've discussed, compliance is not required until the middle of next year, but we are excited to have published this preliminary guidance. Here's the information on where to find that. It's on our Engage site. Here's a visual on the right to help you navigate to there. It'll show you a summary of the law, guidance for implementation, and examples of ways to update local land use codes for compliance. So please go ahead and take a look, and feel free, as with all of these pieces of guidance or compliance tools, please do submit comments, questions, input. As with some of the other laws, we wanted to highlight a few of the common questions that we've gotten. It's been a mixed bag, admittedly. Some questions are very common, others are very jurisdiction specific. And so here are some examples of what has come up more commonly. First off, do subject jurisdictions need to allow internal or attached and detached ADUs? You know, where's the line there? What must be allowed? Yes, the answer is yes, jurisdictions do need to allow those because the definition in the law does include internal, attached, and detached ADUs. Does it need to follow the exact definition of the law? No, subject jurisdictions do not need to use this exact definition in their code, but do review your definition and consider whether that different definition does result in more restrictions on ADUs than are permitted by the law. Does the law apply to mobile home parks? Well, the ADU law requires subject jurisdictions to allow, subject to administrative review, one ADU as an accessory use to a single detached dwelling in any part of that jurisdiction where the jurisdiction allows single unit detached dwellings. The law does define single unit detached dwelling as a detached building with a single unit on a single lot. So that means mobile home or manufactured home parks with multiple homes on a single lot would not meet this definition, would not so the law would not apply to those situations. And then finally, what about parking? We've had questions come up formulated in different ways related to what's required, what's allowed, because there is sort of a limited exception. So here are two comments there. Subject jurisdictions can require a property owner to designate an existing space for the ADU if one already exists. So please note that. And then second, subject jurisdictions can require a new parking space for an ADU in this very particular situation. So it's only when there is no existing parking space, including tandem spaces, parking is required for the single family dwelling, and on-street parking is prohibited on that block. So rather discrete situation, but please note that is an exemption to the prohibition on more parking for ADUs. Okay. Good questions coming in the Q&A. Thank you. Keep them coming. Okay, that's the end. So I'll make some comments and wrap up the next steps, and then we'll dive further into Q&A. But before we do that, some topics for next month. This meeting will be on Friday, same time, same place, but on October 25th. We will be talking about the housing needs assessment methodologies. We'll be talking about displacement risk assessment and housing opportunity goal calculation, initial guidance, TOC calculation model project, and updates on the parking management best practices study. Please note these key links and reminders. We've got our Engage site linked here. We will post these slides there, as well as a recording of this session. We've got our office hours, one-on-one technical assistance offerings, the new guidance that we just published yesterday for parking and ADUs. And then, as Kelly mentioned, on Monday, we'll be parking. Well, yeah, sure. We'll be parking those final maps on Engage DOLA for you to take a look at. Scott, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick note to participants. If you're willing, please include your questions in the Q&A. Then everybody can see the answer and we don't have to retype the question. So thanks, and keep the questions coming.
Thank you, Scott. All right, we will end here with our contact information. Thank you so much for your time and attention, your questions. I'll now stop the recording and we can dive into further Q&A. Only my tabs would stay in the same place. I'll stop the recording. There we go.